Book 8, The Last Day, Chapter 7, The 36th Day of Planting, Part 3 of 4. Boscos raced ahead of his brothers and cousins to the makeshift surgery tent the doctors had established near the temple ruin. So far they had set a couple of broken bones and done a few stitches, but nothing more serious until that morning. When Boscos arrived, the rescuers were being examined by two more doctors. He grabbed a kit and pointed at an apprentice. "Get ready, lots of blood to wipe off. We need to find all of his wounds." Mrs. Rescutar sat up from her cot. "Is it young Pear? How bad is he?" "Bad enough," Boscos said quietly as he washed his hands in a bucket of water, then quickly dipped them into another bucket with a cleansing mixture that made his hands feel like they were on fire. He shook them out just as his brothers and cousins jogged to the surgery area. They laid the net litter down, swiftly extracted young Pear, and carried him to a table. Two more doctors stepped over with wet cloths, while a third came with a knife to cut off his clothing. "Everyone out," called Dr. Toon, who had been helping the rescuers. "We'll let you know as soon as we know. Mr. Brighter," he said, taking Deck's arm as he led him out. "Do your best to occupy Peto and Lilla, all right? This may take some time." Deck nodded. "All right, but who's going to occupy me?" Some of the assistants dropped the tent flaps, and two more experienced doctors went to work on young Pear's torso. Boscos took a cloth and started wiping young Pear's head to determine if the blood splattered there was his or someone else's. "Oh, you're a real mess, young Pear," he murmured, relieved that, for the moment, none of the blood seemed to be his, except for a minor split on his forehead. "Going to be worse around your gut, I'm afraid." The whispered, "Boss," startled him. Boscos caught his cousin's face. "Young Pear! Yes, it's me! And no, I'm not just an assistant anymore. Oh, it's so good to see you!" He grinned as young Pear fought to open his eyes and got no more than a slit. "Although," Boscos added, "I think I'm always finding you like this, horizontal and injured." Young Pear was almost able to form a smile, but it dissolved. "Boss, tell Shem," he struggled to whisper the words, "that I didn't reveal Salem, and I'm so sorry for everything." "No need, no need. Everything's going to be fine now." "Boss," young Pear said as urgently as his frail condition would allow, "it's Mugga. Thorn—" "We know," Boscos interrupted softly. "Papa saw what happened." He didn't think now was the time to tell him about Calla. "Boss, tell them it was because of her. She got me here. And Pugga's never left my side. They both brought me." "Shh, it's enough, young Pear. You can tell everyone later." Young Pear tried to shake his head, a tear slipping from his eye down to his ear, leaving a clean track in the drying mud. "I know it's bad. It's too much. You can't fix this." "Don't say that." Boscos held his cousin's face firmly. "We're not letting you go that easily. We just got you back. We can heal you." "Dr. Zenas," said one of the doctors grimly. He gestured to something on young Pear's torso. Boscos winced, but made sure his expression was optimistic when he turned back to his cousin. "Young Pear, we're going to sedate you now. We need to fix you up, all right?" "It's too much." Boscos kissed his forehead. "You'll be fine, young Pear. We can heal you." "It's all right, if you can't. It'll be all right. Tell Mama that, and that I tried, and please just tell everyone I'm sorry," he mumbled as he drifted into darkness. "Lilla, if he wasn't still alive, they would have come out and told us by now." Peto was rocking his wife as they sat on a log across from the surgery tent, staring intently at the main opening where the flaps remained down. "The longer they're in there, the better the news, right?" She continued to weep, not noticing the hundreds of people walking to the surgery tent and quietly asking for any news. Shem was hunched on another log, his head bent, rocking silently as Esther and Huldah sat on either side of him, each with a hand on his back. Jatesy and Dec positioned themselves on either side of Peto and Lilla. Already they had to jump up twice to catch Lilla as she made a break for the tent. Now Dec sat by Lilla, a heavy hand on her shoulder, as Jatesy leaned against her brother, who comforted his wife. The rest of the family paced quietly, sat down near their parents, or spoke to those who came to inquire about young Pear. They had waited for well over an hour, although it felt much longer than that. When Boscos came out of the tent, everyone stood up. He walked to Peto and Lilla with the expression that all doctors had practiced: hopefulness, no matter what the prognosis. The doctors had been wrong on many occasions, because the Creator was the real healer who decided when someone survived or someone went home. He had several gashes and lost a lot of blood, Boscos explained. He started to gesture to his own gut when he noticed his father shaking his head. Lilla didn't need that much detail. Boscos put on a small smile. Everything's back where it belongs. We've stitched him up and think he has a chance. He's going to make it? Lilla squealed. Boscos put his hands on her shoulders. We think so. We'll know more when he wakes up. When someone loses that much blood. But his aunt and uncle didn't hear any more. Peto kissed Lilla on the cheek, and she caught him in a rib-crushing embrace. Can I see him? Sit with him, she begged. I don't see how I can say no. Just you and Uncle Peto and Papa. Boscos nodded at his father. He turned to the rest of the family. As soon as we know something, I'll come tell you. Lilla and Peto were already racing to the tent. They ducked inside where young Pear, wiped clean with his bare arms and torso wrapped tightly in many bandages, lay motionless on a cot. Solemnly they sat down on log stools on either side of him. Young Pear, Lilla whimpered. It really is you. I can't believe it. She kissed his bruised cheek as gently as possible. Dr. Toon wandered over to them, wiping his hands on a thick cloth. He does have a remarkable way of coming back, doesn't he? I've lost track how many times I've worked on him, but I'm grateful I had the opportunity to do so today. He did a good job on the rescatars for us. He set Mrs. Rescatar's arm as well as I could have. Peto nodded, but Lilla didn't take her eyes off her son. Lilla, Mrs. Rescatar sat down next to her, her arm in fresh bandages and a new sling. This wasn't exactly the kind of arrival we were expecting, and young Pear was nervous as to how you would react to seeing him again. He told my husband last night that he thought you'd be more willing to welcome him back if he brought others with him. Lilla turned to her. How could he think we wouldn't want him back? Oh, young Pear! She kissed his hand. That's what we told him, to not underestimate you. Lilla, Peto, I saw him only a few times before he left Salem, but this young man here is not the same boy I remember strutting around Norden. He was concerned, selfless, and very attentive to Versa and our family. I don't know what he's been through in the world, but you're going to be impressed by who he is today. I certainly am. Thank you, Peto whispered. I just hope we get to see who he is now. Shem came into the tent after Mrs. Rescatar had gone back to her husband's side, and he smiled painfully at his nephew. Well, he whispered, running a hand through young Pear's hair to smooth it back. He looks better than an hour and a half ago. His hair's rather long for someone in the Army, but if he spent the last several weeks locked up as we assumed, I guess that's why he's looking shaggy now. I am interested, though, to hear the story about these ears, he said as he ran a finger over the ragged tops of his ears. Taggings, it looks like. Usually only vial heads allow someone to jab broken glass into their ears, but he seemed to avoid getting branded, he observed, looking over those parts of his body that weren't wrapped in bandages. He leaned over and kissed young Pear on the forehead. I'm going to go see Versa. Let her know. I'll be back later. Peto and Lilla didn't look up, but just nodded, both holding a hand of young Pear and staring at his battered face. Shem stepped out of the tent, told the waiting crowd young Pear was still unconscious, and started off for the midwife's tents. They'd moved Versa there not long ago, and he knew exactly what he needed to help soothe his soul. As he neared the row of small tents, one of the midwives came out. "Guide Zenas, I have someone who wants to see you if you have time." "Versa?" "Yes, she's been asking for you. Are you up to it?" "Of course. Is she up to seeing me?" "Now's a good time. Her mother and sister just left to get their things. They're going to camp here tonight." Shem slipped into Versa's tent. "Hello, Salem's newest mama," he whispered. "How are you?" "Guide Zenas!" Versa beamed from her cot and tried to sit up. "No, none of that," Shem said, coming over to her. "You're not supposed to move for a long time. You did a lot of damage to yourself from what I heard, but at least you're not that sickly shade of gray anymore. You're just extremely pale." He sat down on a stump next to her and peered over to the bundle in her arms. "I'm so proud of you, Versa. You know how women love to tell birth stories? Well, I doubt anyone can top yours. Well done." To his surprise, she became teary-eyed. "Thank you," she whispered. "It wasn't like anything I expected it would be." "It never is." "Guide, how is he, young Pear?" Shem blew out heavily and leaned forward. "They have hope he will be all right." "But you don't?" Shem looked down at the ground. "It's been a very difficult past few days, Versa. Seeing you with the baby reminded me there still are miracles to be handed out. I'm just not sure if there are any for our family." Versa touched his hand. "What's happened? What's wrong?" He looked up at her with a sad smile. Nothing at all, because you have a beautiful little girl," he said, leaning over to look at the baby again. "Who does she look like?" Versa slid the newborn over to him. "You tell me. Besides, I was really hoping you'd be one to hold her." "There's nothing I'd like to do more right now." He took the baby and repositioned her for inspection. "I know who she looks like." Versa sighed. Young Pear suggested the same thing. He told me he spent a lot of time with the general." Shem's eyebrows went up. "Really? I'd love to hear the story if—" He stopped, deciding it best not to finish the thought. He smiled at the baby. "On her, those features really work, just as they do on you, Versa. Beautiful." He leaned back and placed Lemuel Thorne's granddaughter on his chest. "Versa," he said quietly as he began to pat the newborn, "why don't you take a nap? Let a grandpa watch her. I've put one of my assistants in charge for the day. We both could use a quiet hour, don't you think?" An hour and a half later, Shem came out of the tent, helping a weakened Versa into a small cart. She wanted to see young Pear for herself, despite her mother's protest that she needed to rest. But Versa insisted she couldn't sleep, no matter how hard she tried, until she was sure young Pear had a chance to make it. Drusus placed the baby in her daughter's arms, and Shem carefully pulled the cart to the surgery tent, where Boscos was standing as if on guard. Shem raised an eyebrow at his son. Bosco shook his head. "But it's a good sign," he said. "His heart rate is stronger, and the more he sleeps, the more he recovers." "Really?" Shem said, unconvinced. Bosco shrugged. "It's one theory." He turned to the cart. "Versa, how are you doing?" "I'll be better once I see him." "Then let's get you better," Bosco said, helping her out of the cart while Shem took the baby. They walked her slowly into the tent. Peto saw her, stood up, and gave her a gentle hug. "You're tougher than your father will ever hope to be, you know that?" he said as he helped her sit down on his log stump. Lilla reached across young Pear and took Versa's hand. "I may have startled your poor baby. When I saw the name Shin on the jacket as I unwrapped your daughter, I might have yelled a little." Peto scoffed quietly. "That's not what we heard, and we heard you all the way to the summit." Lilla blushed. She's all right, isn't she?" She glanced over at Shem, who was still holding the baby, and he nodded. "I was a little excited." Versa beamed forgivingly. "I only wish I was conscious when you saw the jacket. I can imagine your reaction." Lilla smiled back and watched as Versa tenderly touched young Pear's face, her eyes growing weepy. "You should know, he was so good to me," she whispered as she pushed away some of his hair. "We walked together all day yesterday, talking, laughing, telling each other our stories." Her voice drifted off as she twisted a lock of his hair around her finger. Peto blinked in astonishment. "I hadn't laughed like that in forever," she sighed. "He was so sweet." Peto and Shem exchanged stunned looks. Lilla watched Versa closely. Bosco, standing at the end of the cot, suppressed a smile. "I lied to him about being ready to birth," Versa said, smiling at the memory. "You should have seen his face when he finally realized the baby was coming. Pure horror!" She chuckled sadly and touched his arm. "But he stayed with me, talked me through it, yelled me through it, actually. Even caught her in his jacket. I couldn't have done it without him. I think I gave him that bruise when I was gripping him." She gingerly outlined the purple spot on his bicep. Shem's eyebrows went up. So did Lilla's. Peto squinted. Bosco's put a hand in front of his mouth to hide his grin. "So," Lilla said softly, "tell me about the baby's birth. Seems to be quite a story." "And so it begins," Shem said. "I'll wait outside until Versa's ready to go back." He handed the baby to Lilla, stepped out of the tent, shook his head at everyone to tell them young Pear was still unconscious, and headed for a quiet stand of trees. Shem could block out everything while he was helping someone else. But the feeling had been so strong in the tent, he had to get away from it. He didn't deserve to feel them. All of them were there. He knew it. And he knew they were all trying to reach him. He was so unworthy. Didn't they know what he did? How he betrayed all of them. The two women he loved more than any others both failed because of his actions. He couldn't think anymore. He paced in the stand of trees trying to empty his mind. Even sitting with the baby earlier hadn't healed the hole he gouged in his own chest. Instead, the idea of Lemuel Thorne's legacy continuing, while Murray Shin and Calazinas were gone, seemed to disrupt the balance of the world. As he paced, he felt again the presence of someone very strong nearby, someone he hadn't felt in almost 2 years. But he was too much, too powerful. Shem pushed him away, wishing he could explain why no one should be coming to him. Why the Creator hadn't replaced him yet as guide or sent the deliverer, Shem couldn't understand. Surely there were better men than him. He had able assistants and capable rectors. He was relieved when he saw the tent flap open a few minutes later, Boscos and Peto both supporting a very pale Versa. He pulled Versa and the small wagon back to her tent, focused intently on the contours of the ground and avoiding anything that might bump the fragile new mother who limply cradled her newborn. A few minutes later, as he and Drusus laid her down on the cot, Versa said wearily, "Guide Zenas, I haven't seen your wife yet. Tell Mrs. Zenas I want her to hold the baby. She was predicting she would have blonde hair. Tell her she was right." She closed her eyes in exhaustion. Drusus gripped Shem's arm in sympathy as he merely nodded. "I sure will, Versa. Get some rest now." He kissed the newborn, handed her to Drusus, and left. Peto didn't know how long they sat there. He didn't care. All he could think was, "My boy is home. My boy is home." By the wretchedly happy look on Lilla's face, she was thinking the same thing. She kept brushing aside his hair, touching his scarred ears, wiping away dirt that wasn't there, and kissing his hand. "Come on, young Pear," she'd whisper. "Come on." He's changed, Peto decided. I could see it in the few moments I saw his eyes. And according to Versa, he's changed a lot. The village of Pools was far away, right? Lilla asked as she rubbed her son's hand. Pretty far. He spent all of that time in the army, but he rejected it, Lilla. Just like Shem, just like my father. He turned that jacket inside out. Peto didn't say it out loud, but he hoped it was enough. Young Pear had been on the right path, headed in the right direction. He just didn't make it in time. Or maybe... Tell me again what he said when you got to him, Lilla said. Everything, every last detail. The first thing he said was, Papa, I'm so sorry. After Peto told her again every detail he could remember of their conscious son, Lilla sighed. I wish I could hear him again, just anything from him. I do too, Peto said, wiping away a tear. His wife didn't even bother to wipe hers, just let them slide down her face. This wasn't how it was supposed to be, Peto eventually whispered as he gazed at his son. I was supposed to walk out of the house one evening, glance down the road, and see him strolling along it, a bit sheepishly perhaps, but with that sly grin of his that says, can't stay mad at me forever. Lilla smiled miserably and nodded. I would have started running, Peto continued, and shouting and yelling for everyone, and I would have run straight for him. He would have stopped and braced himself, a bit worried as to what I would do, and a little embarrassed as well. Then I'd hug him. Just hug him and hold him until you got there, Lilla, to make sure he could never run away again. I like that, she sniffled. I always pictured that we were at dinner, and his chair's empty as usual. Then the door would open and he'd peek in as if nothing at all had happened and say, Sorry I'm late for dinner, but I could smell your biscuits, Mama, and I couldn't stay away. Peto chuckled softly and reached across his son to hold his wife's free hand. She squeezed it back. Then, after all the excitement, I'd stay up all night baking biscuits and cookies and Grandma Heisemum's cake, and when he woke up in the morning, I'd have all of it all around his bed so he'd have to eat his way out of there. And never run away again, Peto added in a whisper. And never run away again, Lilla agreed softly. I can't even bake for him here. I got some preserves, but... It's all right, Peto assured her. I can't really hold him either without hurting him more. But you did get to hold him, she reminded him, ignoring the dried blood splotching his jacket, shirt, and trousers. You held him. He knew it. I'm a little jealous, she confessed, and sniffled again. You've got his hand now, he reminded her. She nodded and kissed her son's hand. And again. And one more time, just in case the first two didn't take. Is it wrong, she said, to be looking at this cot and plotting ways of tying him to it? They chuckled quietly together. Peto surreptitiously made sure there wasn't any rope around, just in case. I was going to tell him I loved him when I first saw him, but I don't think I did. That was going to be the first thing I said. I was just too surprised. But I did thank him for coming home. That was going to be the second thing. Did you feel that? Interrupted Lilla urgently. His hand! Did he move that hand? I'm sure he moved this one. Boscos! Lilla, Peto tried to soothe her. I didn't feel anything. He may have just spasmed, and... A soft grunt stopped him. Peto and Lilla stared at each other. Boscos! Peto cried. Boss, come here! The tent flap moved, and Boscos rushed over to them. What's he doing? He grunted. Lilla stood up. Young Pear, come on, please. Aunt Lilla, Boscos said quietly. He's just right there. You don't have to shout. Yes, she does, came the faint whisper. Only way I hear my mama. No one outside the tent needed to ask what was happening. They all heard Lilla scream of, He's back! As it carried outside and far beyond, probably even to the valley floor below. Inside the tent, Lilla was reduced to a sobbing mess as she fell on young Pear's chest. I've missed you so much. I love you. Thank you for coming home, oh young pair. Peto couldn't help but laugh as he cried. There was no room for him to hug his son because his wife was taking every inch she could. His stitches! Boscos tried to pull her back. Aunt Lilla, be careful. All right, back off him a little. It's all right, boss, young pair whispered, as his mother slapped wet, happy kisses on his bruised face again and again. I'll take my punishment. Peto gripped his hand, and young pair peered at him through the slits of his eyes. Thank you, Papa, he whispered. Quite a jump. Peto kissed his hand, the only part of him he could reach, as Lilla continued to smother him. Anything for you. I love you, young pair, he remembered to add. You should try the jump sometime. You're now the only one who hasn't. But not today. Young pair's smile was fragile. That's all right, Papa. I have no more desire to fly. Ever. Peto exhaled in relief. I insist on 1 minute, Bosco said, gently pulling his aunt off young pair. Here, hold this, he said to her, giving her young pair's free hand. Mind the stitching in his arm. He grinned as he leaned over his cousin's face. Young pair, you know the questions. He looked into each eye. Well? Ribs all right, he whispered. Shoulders intact. No other broken bones. I can feel everything, and it still moves. Sort of. He tried to smile. Just slashes to my arms and gut, I think. Very weak, like I lost a lot of blood. And I got smacked in the head. Boscos nodded. Sounds about right. Bruising on your chest, though. He gestured to the bare spots not covered by bandages. Shaped like feet, young pair suggested. Boscos tilted his head. Now that I look at them, yes. Versa? Tell me, boss, there are other positions for that, right? Peto laughed with Boscos while Lilla sniffled. In an emergency, it's as good as any other. So, you want to become a midwife? Boscos asked as he pulled up a bandage and checked some of the stitches. Salima's fully trained and ready for an assistant. Thank you, but no, young pair whispered. Boscos grinned as he readjusted the bandages and patted his cousin's face. All right, Lilla, he's all yours again. Just be gentle. And he stepped back. I'm always gentle, she cried, and fell on young pair's chest again. Young pair flinched a smile. The tent flap moved again. Ralph stood there with Mora and many more bodies pressing behind him. Can we see him? Ralph asked. Young pair's chest began to heave as tears leaked out his eyes. Only if they really want to, he whispered. Peto kissed young pair's forehead. Do you have any doubt? A little, young pair's voice quivered. I've done nothing but hurt them. Then let's dispel all doubt, young pair, Peto said. We've always wanted you back, in any condition, in any situation. We've never stopped loving you. Let them show you. Young pair's chin trembled and he nodded. Peto grinned and turned to the open tent flap. Just be gentle with him. A moment later, the tent was packed, swarming with bodies trying to hug, kiss, or just touch young pair. Bosco stood on the outside of the happy mob, a look of concern on his face. Dr. Toon joined him. We have plenty of the numbing agent, right? He asked Dr. Toon. And a strong brew of the pain tea? Yes, Boscos, we already gave him a dose. Why? Because we're going to have to redo all those stitches. We don't do gentle in our family very well. Shem had been walking to the furthest edges of the sheltered valley, trying to find ways to be useful and block every other thought. He'd been hoping someone needed help locating a child, or setting up a tent, or collecting firewood. But no one wanted to bother the guide, except to give him a hug or pat his back. Even the soldiers who had come up with young pair had been taken care of by one of Shem's assistants, given a campsite and food and water, and an explanation of what they thought might be happening next. Shem didn't bother to introduce himself. Their inside-out jackets jarred him in the strangest of ways. He was considering going back to Versa's tent, the only person who didn't know about Calla, when the news spread out to the back reaches of the tableland. Young Perrin Shin had returned, injured as usual, but was now speaking. There were still miracles. When someone jogged up to give him the news, Shem sat down heavily on a log and held his head. Young Per was going to make it. One fewer death this week. Another hasty burial that didn't have to happen. He had considered the spot next to Calla for young Per, but now the Creator had thought of them. For as much relief as he felt about young Per, somehow it seemed to increase his grief for Calla. If only Calla could have been spared too. Shem felt several people put their hands on his back, heard a few comments of, "We're so happy for you, guide," and "Isn't this wonderful about your nephew?" Nodding, he still looked at the ground, trying to sort out his emotions. He couldn't continue being so absorbed in his own heartache, but he also didn't know how to break out of it. He needed to be ready to address the army that would soon be filing into the valley below because, for now, he was still the guide. During the past hour, he'd been explaining to the Creator why someone else should be called, but the answer always came back. "You are the one I have chosen." But it couldn't be for long. The Deliverer had to arrive at any moment. Mari had said that she thought Shem was the Deliverer, but more and more, Shem did not. Neither did a few Salemites, according to some quiet conversations he heard as he walked earlier. So tragic, what happened to him? Why? Why to him? He can't be the Deliverer, or else he would have been able to save Mrs. Shin and Mrs. Zenas. That was the comment that echoed in his mind. He can't be the Deliverer. He can't be the Deliverer. But he had to shelve everything, his sorrow, his frustrations, his confusion, until the Deliverer arrived, but it was so impossible. After about the 40th pat on his back, Shem stood up, gave a faded version of the dinner smile to everyone around him, and started jogging back to the surgery tent. There was something he could do. Versa needed to see young Per, and Shem needed to see them together again. At least watching whatever was happening between them was a sweet distraction. He didn't stop weaving through people, and didn't even slow down as he jogged by the surgery tent, where he heard only happy laughter and loud conversations, until he reached the midwife's tent. He peeked into Versa's tent and found her awake. "Versa, did you hear the news?" She nodded, her eyes red. "It's so terrible! I can't believe it!" Not sure what she was talking about, and not wanting to deal with any further problems at the moment, Shem stepped in and went down on one knee next to her. "Young Per's all right, Versa. He's awake. I just passed the surgery tent and heard a lot of laughter coming from it." She struggled to sit up. "He's all right. Can I see him?" "That's why I'm here, to bring you to him. What did you think I was talking about?" Her chin wobbled. "I just heard about Mrs. Zenas from my mother. She went to get me a kerchief," she explained as she sniffled loudly. "I'm so sorry. I could tell something was wrong, but I never would have imagined." Well, it was only a matter of time. He couldn't get 5 minutes respite from the grief. At least the baby didn't know. "Thank you," he whispered, knowing that a response was required, no matter how dismal. "But I suppose there are still a couple miracles left for us." He wiped his face, intent on finding something else to think about. "Come, let's go see the latest miracle. I have a feeling he may want to see you." He scooped up Versa, baby included, carried her to the cart, and carefully set her down. Then he pulled her back over to the surgery tent that was still swarming with family. Salima and Lek were next to young Per's head, holding plump Perrin, who was trying to reach a bandage. Heisey was on the other side, holding her son in one arm and keeping her other hand on her younger brother. Lori was just stepping away, balancing her twin daughters who had just met their uncle. There wasn't a spare inch next to young Pear's cot that wasn't filled with a family member eager to tell him something else that had happened in the last 7 seasons. Shem gingerly escorted Versa into the tent, one arm holding her up, the other cradling the baby. Selima sent Versa a look of concern, but she noticed only young Pear. From his prone position, he didn't notice her until the family made way for her to stand next to his head. He was listening to his younger brothers Newell and Q explain what happened between Shem and the sergeant a few days ago, when the movement of Versa caught his eye. His face lit up, but instantly darkened with worry. "Versa, how are you?" he whispered weakly. "I'm all right," she whispered back. "I wanted to see you. Make sure you're really going to make it." Young Pear realized Shem was holding her upright. "What happened? Did you fall?" "No," she said, putting her hand on top of his. "Just snuck out to weed the garden. You were right for once. Wasn't a good idea." She squeezed his hand with whatever little strength she had. Young Pear turned his hand to feebly squeeze hers back. "And the baby?" Versa released his hand and turned to Shem, who'd been trying to be invisible behind her. He hadn't spoken to young Pear yet, preferring instead to be the errand boy rather than the guide, but he managed to smile for his nephew and held up the baby. Young Pear gestured weakly for Shem to give him the newborn, and Shem laid her on his chest. Young Pear closed his eyes and lifted a bandaged arm to place on top of her. "She feels the same," he said, smiling. "So we did everything all right?" Versa looked to Selima. "You amazed me, young Pear," Selima admitted, realizing that with his eyes closed he couldn't see her nodding in approval. "I nearly passed out as an assistant the first time I helped with the birthing, but there you were in the middle of the forest and even tied off the cord and washed the baby. I am almost impressed." Young Pear's smile widened. "Rare that I get a compliment from Selima," he muttered, and Selima chuckled and patted his shoulder. Versa grinned. "I guess that means we got everything right." "Except for the hiking trip this morning?" he asked, his eyes still shut. "Yes," Versa snickered. "The horseback riding we planned for this afternoon should probably wait until the evening." Luck frowned at Selima. "Horseback riding," he whispered. Selima shrugged. "Even if she weren't bleeding so heavily, I wouldn't recommend it." Young Pear heard their whispered exchange. He opened his eyes and slowly winked at Versa, who was chuckling. Shem saw it. His chest tightened as he recognized the look. Perrin's wink in his grandson. He felt the presence again, but it was too much to ask for, too much to hope for. There was too much heaviness in his head to make room for anything else. "Versa," Shem said softly, "we really should get you back. You shouldn't be on your feet, and already I've brought you out twice." "He's right," Selima said, raising her eyebrows in admonishment at both her father-in-law and Versa. Versa nodded wearily, and Selima helped to take the baby off young Pear's chest. "Thank you," Versa whispered as she squeezed young Pear's hand again. Young Pear nodded, his voice giving out on him. "Go rest, Versa. You're safe now. Tonight I'll start working on that arrangement we discussed. I promise." He winked at her again, so slowly that his eyes struggled to open fully again. Versa nodded back, her eyes swimming. Shem knew better than to ask what kind of arrangement young Pear was talking about as he carefully led Versa away. But he had a suspicion. Drusus wasn't the only Thorn woman falling in love. The soldiers were massed later than General Thorn wanted. Several hours later. It seemed many in the army believed they earned sleeping in and taking a leisurely breakfast in their new houses. By midday meal, they began to return to the large staging area in the south, many riding horses and mules they had found, others bragging about their new herds and flocks, and a few complaining that there didn't seem to be a drop of meat anywhere in the wretched valley. Twig did a final tabulation after midday meal, watching from the south-facing window. 49,800. It'll have to be enough, Thorn grumbled, as he stood next to him. How many Salemites can there be anyway, holed up on top of a cliff? He nodded to his messengers with the horns. Sound preparation for forward progress. We're heading for the canyon now. The horns blasted, and Thorn looked around the large gathering room one more time. The officers were filing out of the doors, but he still hadn't seen one particular man that morning at breakfast or at midday meal. He'd expected he would show up by now, but his extended insubordination was surprising. Thorn put his cap on and started out the front door and down the stairs of the porch. He stopped halfway and saw who he was waiting for. Knew you wouldn't be able to stay away, Poe. You have to see the action, don't you? You're a soldier first, Healy. That's why you're my sergeant major. That's why you came back to the army 2 years ago. That's why you're here now. Healy, standing at nothing near attention, merely said, Whatever you say. Thorn smiled thinly. Then I say, get a horse and get to the front of the line, Healy. We've got our greatest victory ahead of us. Just one thing, Healy said, still not moving. You did kill him, right? Thorn stiffened. I killed Shemzinus, Poe. Now find a horse. By midday meal, Peto felt so revived that he wanted to run across the entire tableland, shouting with joy. One part of him was still heavier than the largest boulders, weighted down by the loss of his mother and sister-in-law. But another part of him felt as if it could fly. His son was home. But instead of flying, he did the next best thing. He returned to securing Salem. He knew he needed to, late in the morning, as he watched his family smother his son in kisses and hugs. He stepped outside of the surgery tent, the flaps having been lifted to allow the extended Shin family more room to swarm a weak and emotional young pair. Peto wore a perpetual grin, which only expanded when he suddenly felt a presence next to him, so powerful that his eyes teared up all over again. Peto could even smell him, earthy sweet. Sorry he's in such poor condition, Peto, but he's here. Thanks to you, Father, Peto whispered, not caring if anyone saw him grinning and seemingly talking to himself. I'm so glad you're both back. And thanks to your mother. I could never seem to finish any job without her. Tell her thank you. Where is she? In the middle of that mess of family somewhere, having the time of her life, so to speak. Peto chuckled. By the way, Rector Shin, it's time to get back to work. The army's moved to the canyon. They'll be visible in the valley in less than an hour. Get some people to the edge of the cliff, counting. You know how many there will be. Around 50,000, Peto whispered. That's right. Count to gauge their rate of progress, and send some scouts down the routes to find stragglers, but only as far as the rivers. Some of the deserted soldiers are swarming these mountains. Many are still terrified, some are bloodthirsty, and some are just bored. A weapon in the hands of any of them is dangerous. But they won't cross the rivers. They think they're too cold. There are only a handful of remaining Salemites coming up on the routes. Send them help. Peto nodded again. Of course, Father. And then what? And then somehow I've got to get through that thick skull of Shem's. I gave him quite a lecture early this morning about doing his duty. He slept through all of it, but I think he received the message at some level of consciousness. Otherwise, he wouldn't have recognized the prompting to go to the back door. You know what I'm asking, Father. The last day? Silence. Father? No answer. General, I asked you a question. Peto could still feel him, but no longer heard him. The feeling, as well as his scent, slowly faded. Peto chuckled to himself. His father was always such a tease. He noticed 8 men in reversed army jackets apprehensively making their way over to the surgery, tentative smiles on their faces. Sounds like he's going to make it, one of them asked Peto, hearing the laughter and squeals coming from the tent. Peto grinned. If he survives the family mauling, I'd say he has a very good chance. I want to thank you for bringing him here. One of the men, his dark face bruised, shook his head. He brought us here. He started by luring us with ridiculous stories about the existence of elephants and a perfect life in Salem. Peto sighed in mock sadness. Have to travel many weeks before you see elephants. But they're there, I promise. Just like a perfect life in Salem has always been here. The first soldier held out his hand. Staff Sergeant Beavid, sir. This is my security team. We were in charge of keeping Shin under control. Peto chuckled as he shook his hand. Quite a task. I know. I tried for 18 years to keep him under control, with little success. The bruised man squinted at him. Are you his father? I am. Peto Shin. I'm his real father. Several of the soldiers looked at each other with surprised expressions. The bruised man rolled his eyes. Peto Shin, he scoffed, amused. Thorne imagined all kinds of things, but I don't think he ever imagined that Peto Shin survived, married, and had children. A soldier close to Peto's age and with a thick belly held up his hands. Did you say 18 years? He's 19 and a half now, Peto told him. A younger soldier elbowed the fatter one. That's what he was telling us. He's not 28. Jatesy was never his mother, and Thorne certainly wasn't his father. Peto bristled. No, thank goodness. My sister told us all about Thorne's version after she came back from the second resting station. She made it back safely then? The sergeant asked. Very, Peto smiled. So, asked another soldier, who's his mother? Peto motioned to the crowd in the tent. See, or rather hear, that woman there on the stool? Is she laughing or crying? Beavid asked. Both, Peto grinned. That's his mother. Same loud mouth, the bruised man observed. Peto chuckled. It was so easy to laugh today, unlike yesterday. He turned back to the soldiers. Have you found a place to sleep for the night? We have extra bedrolls and supplies, and a doctor can look at your bruising. He gestured to the young man with a partially swollen eye. Already has, sir, the sergeant said. Knelt here, will live. And we got a tent set up, too, toward the back. Someone who called himself an assistant thought it was best that we stay far away from the cliffside as possible. What exactly is an assistant? Asked another one of the soldiers. Assistants to the guide, Peto explained. He has 12. 11 are here, and each has been given a duty to watch over different areas. All problems and concerns are handled by them, unless something more serious arises. Then the question is presented to the guide. A real guide, not Leonard Croup. Peto shuddered slightly. I knew him in school. He was in a different class, but everyone knew of Leonard Croup. As did your mother, the bruised man called Nelt said somberly. I'm so sorry about that. We all are. He gestured to the men behind him. That was the last thing we could bear to watch Thorne do. We knew then we had to desert. Thank you, Peto said. You did the right thing. You'll all be safe here, all of you. As you saw earlier with that other soldier who fell, no one can come here with malicious intents and survive. I've been wondering about that, said one of the massive soldiers. Who was it that knocked him down? I could tell Snarl's neck was broken even before he finished rolling down to us. The guide, Peto said. "The real guide." The soldiers were taken aback. "Aren't guides supposed to be gentle and loving and give blessings and all that?" asked one of the younger men. "Yes," Peto said. "Yes, they are. They're also supposed to protect and defend the Creator's people until the last day." The bruised man leaned forward as an idea came to him. "You survived. So did your sister, your mother, your father. Is the guide? He couldn't bring himself to say it. The rest of the soldiers looked at him, waiting. Peto paused just long enough to get their full attention. Then he relished the looks of shock when he said, "Our guide is Sergeant Major Shem Zenas." It took several minutes for them to recover. Peto chuckled the entire time. Finally knelt asked reverently, "Where is he now?" Peto gestured to the vast tableland. "Somewhere out there again, walking." More quietly he said, "His wife also died, the same day as my mother. It's been a difficult few days, losing both of them. They were all the very best of friends." The other massive soldier finally shook his head, coming out of his amazement. "Slagging Zenuses! The slagging Zenus survived!" Peto smiled patiently. "You're welcome to stay with us. Salem has always been a place of refuge for those tired of fighting the world. Has been since the very beginning. But we have a few rules you need to follow to stay with us. One of those is respect for all people. So no profanity of any kind is allowed. Shem Zenas has always been the most selfless and perfect man he could be, and his name should never be used so coarsely." The soldier nodded in embarrassment. "Crete, I'm sorry," he mumbled. Peto nodded back. "It's all right. It may take you a little while to adjust, but just keep trying. And, by the way, the same thing goes for the Creator's name in all its variations. It's all right. You'll get it all figured out. Salemites are patient and forgiving. We Shins have been here for almost 3 decades, and they still haven't sent us away." And that is the end of part 3 of 4 of chapter 7. Thank you.